And so you get that. And then, this is what, to me, makes education worse, is that's already a problem. Who controls public education is the government. They care less about either one of those things. And they can care less about what's going on in actual schools, and they can care less about what the research says we should be doing in schools, and much more about where our money's coming from. And those are the people that we're going to, and that becomes the worst part of the whole.
Yep, it is.
Like if they at least align themselves with one of these,
But they don't.
but no, we're going to do more. There's more.
Yeah.
For the day.
Yeah, we could talk about that for hours. Ugh, hash it up for a while. Okay. We're ready. We're live and everything.
Sounds good. I'm going to shut this door.
Well, I can get the door. You can go sit down. Okay, or you do it. You be stubborn.
I will be.
Okay.
Good morning. Good morning. Mind shutting the door on your way in? So would you mind shutting the door on your way in? So you don't yell at me, I'll go ahead and go take my seat.
That's funny.
It's not. We'll see. I'm working my way out of the booth. At least for now. I went to the doctor Monday and had a mediocre appointment,
Why was it mediocre?
I guess. Well, so we got to go over in detail my MRI results, and the damage was worse than I realized. Inflammation of the Achilles, fluid buildup, internal bruising, bone contusion, and some ligament damage on the inside. So there's a lot more going on. It's going to be a lot longer recovery process than I was thinking. And then that's mixed with, since we don't know what popped, he's a little concerned that rest and PT won't be enough.
I'm a lot concerned about that.
And so, if it's not, next step is steroid shots. And the step after that was he'll have to open it up and look and see what it looks like in there, and probably clean out some of the damaged portions. And then that's, from that moment, it would be another 6 months to a year recovery. So we could go 6 months recovery and then have to do surgery and then have another year-long recovery, theoretically. So I could be hobbling around for a while. But we're hoping that's not going to be the case, and that rest and physical therapy will get me back to normal. But we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, enough with that. We are on Psalm 89. To get it started, it is a long one, so we will break it up. I'm going to start out by reading the first 18 verses this morning. I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations. I declare that your steadfast love is established forever. Your faithfulness is as firm as the heavens. You said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn unto my servant David. I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God feared in the council of the holy ones, great and awesome above all that are around him. O Lord, God of hosts, who is as mighty as you, O Lord. Your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth is also yours. The world and all that is in it. You have founded them. The north and the south, you created them. Tabor and Hermon joyously praise your name. You have a mighty arm. Strong is your hand. High your right hand. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Happy are the people who know the festal shout, who walk, O Lord, in the light of your countenance. They exult in your name all day long and extol your righteousness. For you are the glory of their strength. By your favor our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, our King to the Holy One of Israel. And Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your word together. It is in your Son's name that we pray. All right, Mark chapter 3. We finished up chapter 2 last week. This first story in the first 3 verses of Mark 3, the first 6 verses of Mark 3, is the conclusion to this second section of the gospel that has been focused on Jesus' controversies. I've mentioned that Mark, beginning in chapter 2, he draws together a bunch of controversy stories between Jesus and the religious leaders of the first century. Primarily, as the story comes to its conclusion, we see between Jesus and the Pharisees. But it's not just the Pharisees. We've got Pharisees, we've got scribes, we've got other Jewish authorities or religious leaders as well that Jesus clashes with. One thing that I want to highlight as we conclude this section is that there's an escalation there's an escalation in the controversy. So at the beginning, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives his sins, and the leaders think within themselves, so they're thinking in their own minds, who is this guy who claims to be able to forgive sins? And then in the second controversy story, when Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, they move from thinking within themselves to going to the disciples and asking Jesus' disciples, well, who is this guy that you're following who thinks that he can eat with tax collectors and sinners? And that escalates from asking the disciples to questioning Jesus in the next 2 controversy stories. They go directly to the source and they ask Jesus, well, who are you who think that you can do these things? And then finally, here in chapter 3, the conclusion is going to be them making plans to kill Jesus. So we escalate from the religious leaders just thinking internally, who is this guy, to, in essence, being fed up with Jesus and what he's doing, and they make plans to try and kill him at the end of this story, at the beginning of chapter 3. So I'm going to start and read Mark chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This story begins with the reference that Jesus went into the synagogue. There's an article there, which might mean that Mark is not talking about a general synagogue. So Mark's not saying Jesus was traveling around and the Sabbath day came and he went into the synagogue wherever he happened to be. But it could mean that Mark is talking about a specific synagogue. So we might think that Jesus is back in Capernaum. We talked about Capernaum is where Jesus' ministry in Galilee, the northern section of what was the Promised Land, the area of the Mediterranean. That northern area is where Jesus begins his ministry. His home base is in Capernaum, which is right along the Sea of Galilee. And that makes sense why when Jesus begins preaching, teaching, healing, as a part of that, he calls his disciples, and we know that some of them, James and John, for example, are fishermen. He calls them from their boats. They're mending their nets, which makes sense because he's right along the area of the Sea of Galilee. It also makes sense why we get stories about Jesus is next to the sea and does some teaching, or you may recall stories of Jesus being next to the sea and there's this great crowd around him, so large that Jesus decides that he needs to get into a boat and kind of push back a little bit from the crowd to have some room to sit down and teach. All of that makes sense in Capernaum being kind of his home base. So where he does a lot of his work is right along that edge of the Sea of Galilee. And the people in Capernaum have already seen him do a lot of amazing things. So when he heals the paralyzed man, for example, he's in Capernaum. And this dates all the way back to Jesus begins his ministry in Capernaum, and then he goes to the home of Simon, or Peter, and a great crowd comes to him after the Sabbath is over. Mark tells us that everyone who was sick or demon-possessed came to Jesus. And then Jesus has to leave the city and go to desolate places to get a little bit of a break from the crowd. Then in chapter 2, he comes back into Capernaum, and he's in a house, probably Peter's house once again, and he's teaching, and there's so many people that they couldn't even fit inside of the house. The crowd extends outside of Peter's home, and this is the context in which men bring Jesus the paralyzed man. They can't get into the house, so they have to go up onto the roof, right, and dig a hole and lower the man down through. And so here, perhaps Jesus is back in Capernaum, which is significant simply because everybody here knows Jesus. They've seen a lot of the miraculous works that Jesus has done. They have heard a lot of Jesus' teaching, and so everyone knows who this man is. And so when Jesus enters into the synagogue, it makes sense that people's eyes are on him. What's Jesus going to do? What is he going to say this time? And in this context specifically, Mark tells us that they watched to see what he would do. So the Jewish religious leaders who are in the synagogue are watching Jesus to see what is he going to do this Sabbath day. He's eaten on the Sabbath. He's healed on the Sabbath. He's done all kinds of things on the Sabbath that they didn't think he should be doing. And so they're watching him to see what is he going to do on this Sabbath day. And you'll notice that in their midst is a man with a withered hand, which is odd because he shouldn't be in the synagogue. A man with a disability like his would be considered unclean, so you wouldn't really want to be in large crowds of other Jews, especially if there were Pharisees present, because they were very concerned about their purity. So to come in contact with this man would make someone else unclean. So it's odd that this man is in the synagogue. But what's even more odd about the way that Mark tells this story is it doesn't appear the man's in the synagogue to see Jesus. So Jesus encounters a demon-possessed man before he's coming to find Jesus, right? And in that case, it's probably not the man coming to Jesus to be cleansed, but the demon coming to kind of call out Jesus or to battle with Jesus or something like that. But this doesn't seem to be the case here, because the way that Mark tells the story is Jesus is in the synagogue, so he's at church, he's at worship, and he looks out into the crowd, and he sees, well, there's this man with a withered hand over here, and there are these Jewish authorities over here who are just waiting for me to do something that I shouldn't do. And so Jesus is like, if that's what you want, I'll go ahead and do it. So he goes and calls the withered man to come to him. Jesus takes the initiative to go and heal this man, which is a little bit different than the other healing stories so far in the gospel, where Jesus comes across someone or somebody comes to him and Jesus heals. In this case, Jesus kind of goes out of his way to make a point to the religious leaders about not only his authority, but I think more particularly the way that they are thinking about the law, particularly the Sabbath. So you go back to the end of chapter 2, and there's the controversy of eating on the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field, and the disciples are taking the head of grain and eating it as they go through, and the religious leaders, the Pharisees, think that this is them working, so they should be doing this. And Jesus' response is to say that the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. And his point is, he doesn't necessarily disagree with the Pharisees here. He doesn't say the Sabbath is unimportant, you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. He doesn't even address whether or not plucking heads of grain is considered work on the Sabbath. What he does is remind them of the purpose of the laws that God has given, and the laws there are to benefit humanity, to allow humankind to enter in to the kind of life that God created and designed for us. And what Jesus is saying is that when the laws become burdensome for people, when the way that you are applying and following the laws moves to an area where it is, instead of allowing humanity to thrive, it is preventing them thriving. Now human beings aren't living the life that God intended for them because of the rules, which is kind of an interesting thing. Of rules, on the one hand, can allow us to live the life that God desires for us, but they can also at times become a hindrance. The way, if we become too rigid in the way that we follow and apply, as the Pharisees have done in this case, Jesus' point is that now they become a hindrance to the life that God wants for you. Jesus is kind of continuing this thing, or Mark is continuing this thing by bringing these stories together in Jesus instructing the religious leaders once again about the nature of the law. And so this is what Jesus says to them in verse 4. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or kill? Now, something that may be going on here is Jesus speaks of not healing this man as if you're killing the man, which isn't the case, right? If Jesus waited until tomorrow to heal the man, it doesn't appear like he's going to die within the next 24 hours, right? And to heal the man is to save his life. Again, it doesn't appear like his life is in jeopardy. So by healing the man, his life technically isn't saved. By not healing the man, his life isn't technically going to end. But according to Jews in the first century, it seems that if someone was dying on the Sabbath, you had the right to heal them. So you weren't to work on the Sabbath, but you also weren't supposed to be like, well, you're dying, that's unfortunate, it's the Sabbath day, I can't help you. That's not the way that it worked. Pretty much all the Jews were in agreement. When somebody's life is on the line, a human life becomes more important than our Sabbath observance. So you save the life. The problem here, like I said, is that the man's life isn't at risk. Jesus could have waited until technically Saturday night. I mentioned that Jewish days go from sundown to sundown. So when the sun goes down on Saturday, we move out of Sabbath into the next day. So Jesus could have just waited until the end of the day when the sun set to heal the man, and it wouldn't be on the Sabbath. But what Jesus is doing, and I'm going to quote a scholar here. I like the way that he talks about this. He says, Jesus refuses to draw a distinction between saving life in the narrowest sense and the offer of full life, which characterizes his whole ministry. By their attitude, the Pharisees destroy life rather than save it. By neglecting opportunities to do good, they do harm. And so what Jesus is doing is he's not distinguishing between saving life in the narrow sense of do you continue to breathe? Because all the Jews are in agreement. If life in that sense is on the line, you do everything you can, even on the Sabbath day, to save the person. Because Jews, like us as Christians today, have a very high view of life. Both Jews and Christians, we view life as something that is a gift of God. Because of Genesis, we view human life as in the image of God. And so protecting life and caring for life, preserving life, is something that was very important to Jews, and that carries over, becomes very important to us as Christians, even to today. But Jesus doesn't distinguish between that aspect of life and life in its fullness. And that is a full life now. And so Jesus sees this man with a withered hand, and Jesus knows you're not at danger of not breathing anymore, but you don't have the fullness of life. There's something that is hampering your life. And so Jesus equates saving life not only to keeping people breathing, but helping people into the fullness of the life that they can have now. And in the case of this man, it is to heal his withered hand. And the accusation then that Jesus is throwing against the Pharisees is that by neglecting to help people like this, and we don't know, here's the thing, we don't know the extent of how much the Pharisees may have not wanted to help a person like this. Maybe the Pharisees were in the habit of never helping a person with a disability like this man. Or maybe merely they were unwilling to help somebody like this on the Sabbath day, where you've got to wait until tomorrow. Whatever the case may be, Jesus is equating the Pharisees not stepping in to help people into the fullness of life. He equates that to them killing. He in essence says, if you're not going to help somebody like this into the fullness of the life that they can have now, you might as well just get rid of them. There's not much of a difference. And it's kind of like, if you remember on the Sermon on the Mount, which we don't have in the Gospel of Mark, but in Matthew, Jesus says that it's not just enough to not murder somebody, but you don't even become angry at them. You become angry at your brother or sister. You've in essence committed murder in your heart, and Jesus equates the two there. He's doing something similar here. I would argue that what Jesus is doing is, I do think that he's overstating the point a little bit to drive it home, right? I'm not sure that Jesus thinks that murdering someone is just as bad as not caring for this man with a withered hand. I'm not sure that, if Jesus was here and we asked him, are those two really equal? I imagine that Jesus would say, no, they're not equal. But I think what he's doing is he's overstating the point to drive it home. And in essence to say that not helping a man like this is not just a minor thing, it's a major thing. It might not be as major as just walking down the road and murdering somebody, but it's major. It's important enough to Jesus for him to equate the two to drive home the point to the Pharisees, whose hearts have been hardened. So you notice Jesus becomes angry at their hard hearts. And this connects us back to, you might remember at the end of chapter 1, there's a leper that comes to Jesus. And most of our Bibles today say that Jesus has compassion on him, but that the original text was likely angry. Jesus becomes angry when he sees the leper. And I mentioned that the way that I interpreted that is Jesus is not mad at the leper for having leprosy or coming to him to be healed or something like that. But Jesus is seeing brokenness. He's seeing human life in a way that God did not desire for it to be. And Jesus becomes angry at the brokenness that he's seeing in the world. And we get the same thing here. Jesus sees not just this man with a withered hand who makes him unclean, who prevents him from doing things. So you think about how you work and get money in the first century. A man probably needed both hands. I can't think of very many occupations. There were some, but there aren't a lot of occupations in the first century that you can do with one hand. Like today, there's a lot more things that somebody could do and be successful at, only having one hand, but not so much in the first century. So Jesus sees this man in the predicament that he's in, and he sees the Pharisees who are unwilling to do anything about it. Their hearts have become hard, and Jesus becomes angry. Because this is, on the one hand, with the man, this isn't the kind of life that God desires any human being to have. But on the other hand, the Pharisees, who are a part of the people of God, aren't doing anything about it. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So Israel is supposed to be the light of the world. Israel is to be better at bearing the image of God than everybody else, which part of that means that they are bringing about God's purposes in the world, and yet they're seeing a man whose life does not display the purposes of God, and they're not doing anything to try to remedy that situation. Something else to mention about the hardness of heart here is that you may remember that is a term that is used in the Old Testament for Israel when they are disobedient. Their hearts become hardened to God. And Jesus is kind of accusing the Pharisees. Well, he doesn't actually say this, so I guess Mark is accusing the Pharisees of reenacting the disobedience of Israel. So we've been in Israel's story, and we see that time and time again, right? Under Moses, which is why they have to wander in the wilderness. Under the judges, we're now to the kingship, Saul, David, Solomon, and there's some ups and downs during the United Kingdom, but when they split, things kind of go downhill rather quickly, and we see their hardness of hearts once again. And so Mark is saying that the Pharisees are displaying in this moment the same kind of hard-heartedness that Israel does. And I think particularly Mark may have in mind when the prophets come on the scene in the Old Testament, they accuse the Israelites not just of idol worship, which is partly the problem, but that's kind of the secondary problem in most of the prophets. The primary problem is their treatment of the poor and the widow and the orphan. And so Mark may be seeing in this story a similar type of thing. We don't have in this story we might be able to assume that a man with a withered hand is poor because of his inability to work. But just for the sake of argument, let's say that that's not the case. So we don't have a poor, a widow, or an orphan in this story. But nevertheless, Mark likely sees a connection of in the way Israel mistreated those who were in need. That's now what the Pharisees are doing. Not only by not trying to help this man, but getting mad at Jesus for doing so. And the story concludes with, and this is what's interesting, the Pharisees gathered together with the Herodians to plot how they're going to get rid of Jesus. Now, the Herodians are supporters of Herod, which are not the Pharisees. So you can imagine that these are, in essence, two different political parties. The Pharisees want Rome and Herod overthrown. They want Israel reestablished. The Herodians are in support of Herod. They're in support of those who are in power and of the government. And so they are as far away from each other politically as you could possibly get. And yet Jesus is enough for these two groups to come together, which says something about just how much the Jewish leaders hated what Jesus was doing, to come together with their political enemies to plot together how they're going to get rid of Jesus. Because, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the end of the story, the Jewish leaders don't have the authority to kill Jesus. That's something that only the Romans can do. So they would need the support of a Herod, somebody who is a part of the Roman government. And so that's also why they joined together with the Herodians, because they're going to need their help. I've got a little bit of application things that I want to talk about here in a moment, but I've talked for a while. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, thoughts? Anything? Um, so when I read this story, here's what comes to my mind. I think of what it means to be pro-life in our world today, right? As Christians, I think that standing on the side of life is always the right decision. And Jesus and the Jews of his day would agree with that statement. So, like we've talked about, if human life is valuable and meaningful, if human life is always a gift and a blessing of God, if human life reflects the image of God, so we look at a human being and we see the image of God. There was a preacher who was once asked what he had done that morning. He said, well, I spent my day with God. Somebody asked, well, so you spent your time praying, reading your Bible, meditating, fasting, some kind of spiritual discipline. And he said, no, I spent my day riding the subway. He said, but in riding the subway, and I got to look around at all of these people around me, I saw the very image of God. And so that conviction that we have of the value of human beings leads us to want to be people that in every situation we stand on the side of human life. Now, sometimes that becomes very messy and very sticky and very gray, and I'll get to some points of that here in a few moments. But it's kind of like it's been a while now, but in our teen class a while back, we were talking about one of the age-old questions for thinking through ethical reasoning. Is you have a train that's on the track, there's two ways it can go, and either way it's going to kill someone, and there's different ways too. Maybe you have one person over here and 5 people over here, and you have control of the lever. What do you do? And it addresses the, how do you think through ethics when things aren't quite so black and white, right? If there's 5 people over here and nobody over here, the answer's pretty simple. But when you have these choices, how do you think through them? An example that I've given here in class before is what Jews came after the Holocaust to refer to as choiceless choices, Jewish theologians. And the example that they gave of this was the mothers in the Holocaust who, they and their children were taken, and let's say a mother had 2 children, and they had to decide which child lives, which child dies, and no decision is both of them die. And so ethical choices sometimes aren't quite as simple as we want them to be. But nevertheless, I think even when things get a little bit difficult, a little bit gray, a little bit muddy, back to our points of the value that we place in human life, we try to stand on the side of life, and that's what I argue. The difficulty sometimes is what decision is standing on the side of life, and that's not always as easy and cut and dry, but I would argue that's what's meant to go through our minds. Now, when we think about being pro-life today, just because of the political climate that we think of protecting life in one very, very narrow sense, right? When somebody says pro-life, they're talking about unborn life. And so you're not only talking about one narrow definition of life, so life as in living, breathing, existing, right? But you're talking about living, breathing, and existing for one particular subgroup of human beings, right? Human beings who are unborn. That's the way that we use the term. And definitely that narrow definition is one that I would argue is important for us in those situations to find ways to stand on the side tends to happen in the world and in churches today is we get the pro-life, standing on the side of life thing. We do a very good job of it when it comes to unborn life, and then we kind of mess it up once people are born. And that's a criticism that the church gets a lot from the outside, and I think it's a fair criticism. The criticism that you care more about human life before it's born and not very much about human life after it's born. And I think that tends to be a fair criticism sometime. And I say that because that's in essence the criticism that Jesus pushes against the Pharisees. He says, you stand on the side of life, but you've defined it too narrowly. He says, you would say it's okay for me to save this person's life if they were at risk of dying. But you have a problem with me standing on the side of this man's life by healing the disability that he has, healing his withered hand, and allowing him to enter into a more full life as God desires for him. And so what Jesus is wanting to do here is, in essence, to use modern day terms, he's wanting to expand the definition of what it means to be pro-life. He wants to expand what it looks like to stand on the side of life, and not just define it as death versus life, but also in terms of the fullness of life that we can have now, life as God desires and intends for it to be. And so even if we had the time, we wouldn't spend it doing this, but I want to give a couple of examples about, how we might expand the way that we think about what it means to be pro-life, what it means to stand on the side of human life. And so even when we think inside of the context of abortion, it's not always as cut and dry as we want to make it, right? There's some extenuating circumstances that sometimes can surround a pregnancy that we have to think through, right? In those situations, what does it look like to stand on the side of life? We've got to ask questions about the health of the mother and not just the health and birth of the child. Those are two very, very important things to think about. And that brings in, not to get political again, I don't want to actually dive into this, but it brings up questions of healthcare in that too, and access to healthcare, particularly for people who are of lower income or who are living in poverty. What is their access to healthcare, and how does access to healthcare, and in essence, that's questions of the health of the mother. How does that then correlate to the way that we might want to be pro-life when it comes to unborn life? And so that tends to complicate the question a little bit more. It's not so easy just to say, well, don't do that, because there's a whole host of problems that might lead somebody to do that maybe we'd be better off dealing with the actual problems instead of what tends to be a symptom. I would argue that abortion tends to be a symptom of other problems that exist within our society and within the lives of other people. That might be a debate for another day. I'll continue to move on then. Other ways that we may think about standing on the side of life that we don't think about all that much. And when in our teen class, when we were thinking about ethics, we were thinking about the ethics of the taking of life. And I wrote up on our board, well, there's a lot of ways that life can be taken. And we were talking about, okay, so murder's wrong, but we have to ask questions of, well, what constitutes murder, right? So abortion is one, war is another, death penalty would be another. And too often, as Christians, I'm not so sure we fully think through some of the other ways that life is taken in our world, outside of ones that most Christians are in agreement that elective abortion and murder, so just killing somebody for no reason, is wrong. I wonder how often in our churches we discuss the ethical considerations of war or self-defense or the death penalty, or those are other situations where life is taken, and the question of what might it look like in those different scenarios for us as Christians to stand on the side of life. And the difficult thing about that is that in a lot of those other areas, not all Christians are on the same page. So you take the example of war, and let's just think about it in our Church of Christ heritage. Today, I would argue we are at least okay with war, if not some being pro-war, but I think we're okay with war to some degree. Our roots, though, were in pacifism. So for the first half of our existence, we were pacifists, very, very anti-war. And it actually caused a lot of people within our movement to actually go to prison because of the way that they stood opposed to wars that we were in. My point in saying that is even just within our fellowship in Churches of Christ, we have not only changed over time, but I imagine if I polled everyone in our church, we all wouldn't exactly agree on the answer to a question like that, which kind of tends to muddy things up a little bit as well. But another thing that I want to point out is Jesus here, he's expanding the way that we think about life beyond just life and death, but to, like I said, the fullness of human life. And so that comes into the way that we care for the needs that people have. Physical needs, food needs, monetary needs. I mean, there's all kinds of things that hinder human beings from entering into a life that God desires for us to have. And ultimately, right, in this life, nobody's going to have a life that perfectly models God's intention for human life. But I think Jesus' point is that is our goal. So I think his point is we don't sit back and say, well, it's impossible for us to solve all the problems, so we're not going to try or we're not going to do anything. I think Jesus' point is we do what we can. Jesus could heal this man, so he's going to heal this man. Healing this man probably didn't solve every problem that this man had in his life, but it solved at least one of them. There was something in this moment that Jesus was able to do and did, and I think that's kind of Jesus' point of, again, when we're thinking about what it means to pro-life, stand on the side of life, it's also caring for those kinds of needs. It's not, Jesus would say, it's not enough just to say, well, you're alive, and I support you staying alive, and now I don't have to do anything else with you. But Jesus would say, no, you're alive, I'm going to support you staying alive, and I'm going to do as much as I can to help support the life that you have. And so with that, this is the last thing that I'll say because I'm at time. With that, that also means that we have to think about the quality of life for other people. And that's in the way that we live. That's in the way that we manage the resources that we have. That's also in the way that we engage with politics. So when we did our theology of politics over the summer, if you remember, we didn't get into the 3 Ps, people, policies, and parties, but we just kind of talked about some general principles that Scripture talks about. We concluded with the idea of loving your neighbor, that I care for other people's needs first. And so in being people that are pro-life, Jesus would also say that in doing that, we have to be thinking about the quality of life of other people. And this is where it gets difficult, like everything else that we've talked about. Sometimes your quality of life, raising your quality of life, lowers mine. And that it's very difficult then for me to say, I'm going to do things to help your quality of life at the expense of mine. That's not a very easy thing for me to say. Here's the other difficult thing. In the world that we live in, most decisions that are made change different people's quality of life. I'm not sure there's one change that we could make in the way that our world operates today that would increase everybody's quality of life. It would increase some, it would harm. So now we have to ethically, we have to get into some issues of, well, whose quality of life am I concerned with first, and then second, and then third? And by the way, it's not mine. It's not my families. It's not my churches. That's not number one. That is at the bottom of the list, at least the way that Jesus operates. And so the debate, again, unfortunately in our world today, the debate has kind of been, is it other people or is it myself, has been happening a lot. And that saddens me because that's not the debate. Jesus seals that question. It's not me. I'm not at the top of the list. The debate is, how then do I care for the needs of everybody else when I can't do them all at the same time? Which becomes a very difficult, that's even a difficult thing for us to do in our community, right? I mean, if we had the resources, we'd help everyone, but we can't. And so how do you navigate in those muddy waters of standing for the life of people? I probably said too much there, talked too long. We are out of time. We will pick up there. We're going to move in to the next section of Mark's Gospel next week, where he begins to talk about the nature of the kingdom. So he sets apart his 12 disciples and then begins to talk about the nature of this renewed kingdom of Israel that he's bringing about, that is imagined by the 12 apostles that mirror the 12 tribes of Israel.